Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IntraCultural podcast. I'm Missy.
And I'm Lucy, and we're two anthropologists that co founded a DEIB firm called Willing Observers. The IntraCultural podcast covers a range of topics and answers common questions that can be better understood using the concept of culture. Before we get it started, we wanted to make a quick plug for the ICS programs, the Inclusive Culture Strategy. We do a certificate and a certification. So if you're interested in learning more and become more proficient in DEIB, whether that's to help you in your career development or in your current profession, it's a really updated course where we're talking about and applying all the changes of DEI landscape into the program. And essentially, the goal is that by the end, you'll get a certificate or a certification so you can learn how to create more inclusive cultures in your department, organization, university, you name it. And the main difference between the two programs is that one of them is gives you the foundations and the concepts, and the other one we help you develop your own strategic plan. And there's additional more resources in a toolkit that comes with that. And what else? Let's say anything else I forgot about the programs, Missy?
No, you did a great commercial interlude though. So we don't need it's like we should have introduced it like the Intercultural Podcast, sponsored by ICS. I like it.
And I did not script that. That just came out of my head like that. So maybe I should go into marketing and
There you
no.
go.
Well, let's see. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a 50% discount, a permanent discount for anyone that's been unemployed because of the Trump budget cuts. No, because of Trump's anti-DEI executive orders. So
Because of Trump's existence. If you are unemployed because of Trump's existence, although that would probably extend further now that we've had tariff week. So
that is totally fine. Come get a 50% discount. We support you no matter what discipline you're in.
oh my goodness. So how has your week been, Lucy?
Not as busy as yours, but it was mostly good. I think I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast series that I was in a car accident last holiday break. So I'm healing, going to all the therapies, and I had a really intense massage yesterday that was very painful, but also very good.
Sorry. That does not sound like when I think massage, I'm always like, oh, massage. But no.
Part of it was until my massage therapist said, I was like, "Ooh, I see there's some little sensitive spots there." It's like, correct. You heard my breathing and interpreted appropriately.
Oh,
But
well.
it was good. Overall, it was good. How about yours? Yours was not as great, I know.
Yeah, it was just it was constant. And there was I don't know that we always try to like track the astrological cycles. So I don't know if it's like Mercury or if we're getting to a full moon period, but there's just a whole bunch of people this week that were like, "Are you really an expert?" Because I'm not sure you're an expert. And so there was a lot of challenging of my expertise this week in not very nice ways. And I was just like, no.
I know that listener today when we're recording this podcast, we had a training in the morning and I had to kind of jump in to the defense of Missy because your credibility was questioned in front of a whole room of people. It was like, how? No. And I did it by, educating people on how scholarship works and how we choose citations, etc. But you're right, that was not the first time that happened to you this week.
No, no, no. It was like a whole week worth of it. And I was like, what is going on? So, um, I am glad that it is Friday. I am going to, after this podcast recording, so we are recording on a Friday, and after this podcast recording, I am going to go have a glass of wine and take a nap.
Good. You deserve it. And the way you handled the critiques were super gracious and you defended yourself and with more citations and more evidence. So again, reinscribing the fact that you are an expert.
Thank you.
Performance of defending yourself as an expert.
What do I always say it's citations are my love language.
That should be a bumper sticker
I know, right?
in a t-shirt and be on all the places.
Oh, I'll get it tattooed right here on my forehead.
Uh,
Right. Anyone
if
listening, I on my forehead tattoo. Um, and speaking of citations, so where are we going today? So today we are addressing a question that we've wanted to address for a while, and we phrased it as, aren't all DEI trainings bad? So go ahead.
which gets to the question of expertise, right? Because usually, if you hire someone to do a training, you expect them to be more of an expert than you are. So I think it's timely.
Hmm.
We did not plan it that way, but
No,
food
but
for thought.
I know, right? It's like we're just so good. So we thought about this topic and we chose this topic in part because as DEI becomes more public, there are a lot of different kinds of questions that we're addressing. And I think that as we've talked through it, there are some legitimate critiques of the DEI industry that we need to address. And in part, that's because they're being weaponized right now to suggest that DEI is overall problematic or irrelevant. And so we're trying to not shy away from those critiques at this moment, but address them in a more substantial way. So this is the first in a series of critique questions that we're going to address. So today we're going to focus on DEIB trainings, but we're also going to focus on questions that we often hear and critiques that we hear about DEI being part of wasting resources. And we're going to hit at least a third question on whether or not DEI is a sneaky partisan agenda. But we do invite all of you, if you are listening, to contact us and send questions or critiques that you want to hear us address because we are happy to add that to the series list.
Yes, highly encourage you to do that. And just want to mention that it's important not to shy away from these critiques because, to be frank, they are very legitimate critiques. And if we do want to continue growing as a field and create more legitimacy for us, we need to take the critique where it's realistic and well deserved, adapt, pivot, and challenge the critiques when it's not well deserved. So I know, from the over 10 years that I've been doing this work, that DIB has always had questions and concerns in legitimacy around issues of competency. Like, are the trainers competent? Are the DEIB professionals equipped to do the work? And that's not necessarily bad critique to make or an uninformed one, especially when we see who is appointed to do DEIB work. It's not necessarily the people who have had training in DEI. It's historically a lot of the times been someone that just looks like they're non-white or a woman or from a marginalized community who is tasked to do DEI work now. You go do it. So we can see how these kinds of critiques around competency have become popular because it's to some extent reflected some of the issues we have had in creating legitimacy around the field.
Right. And, it's it's really difficult when people just get kind of selected and put into these positions because you're expected to do all of this work that is highly complex and that is really sensitive and that requires upskilling. And people aren't necessarily, they're placed in these positions, they're not necessarily given those resources, and then they just have to kind of figure it out. And that's a much larger issue and much larger problem, but I think it also generates some of these critiques around, like today's topic, how DEIB trainings work, how they're structured, and what they kind of leave you with at the end. And some of them really are not good trainings. They're just not.
Some of them are not. And Missy and I are very critical of bad DEIB trainers too. And again, so I mean, we're having two different conversations, but they're kind of influencing each other, right? Who is appointed to do DEI work in an organization that may not have the background and experience and expertise in doing DEIB work, and then who is doing these trainings, which may or may not be the same group of people. It could be a consultant who claims to be an expert, but they might not necessarily have the competencies to do trainings. But all of these things are interrelated. And also, one of the reasons why we developed the ICS certificate and certification programs, because we wanted more people to do better DEIB work. And to the extent that we can do that, I think we want to help people become more competent.
Absolutely. It's also why we do this podcast and have a whole bunch of free resources and toolkits so that if you're struggling with how to like think about putting these things together, we can at least give you some tools and pathways to do it. But before we get there, let's
I
talk about my favorite topic. Oh
wait,
no,
wait,
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 wait.
don't say
Mm.
I wanted to just say really quickly that we don't say any of this in a way that's meant to make someone feel bad. You know, if you're listening to us and you're like, oh, that's me, I was put in this role and I've never done DEIB work, that's okay. Like, that's part of the system that we live in. So this is not meant to be a ding on that. We're just taking in the critique and responding to the critique. Uh,
Absolutely.
Sorry, Missy. Now go ahead.
Now go. Okay. So that gets us, this is something that, as I said, I've wanted to talk about for a long time because one of the reasons that I ended up kind of moving into this space was because I encountered some trainings that seemed very counterproductive. And I'm guessing that a lot of people listening to this podcast have also encountered a DEI training that they felt was counterproductive or problematic in some way. And so let's address some of those critiques head on. So,
Can I give
Lucy, are DEI trainings sometimes counterproductive?
yes. Sometimes they are. And actually it's you say that you've been in the trainings are bad. That's one of the reasons that I started my DEIB journey was because I went to a DEIB related workshop and it was so horrible. This was in 2011, maybe 2012. And it was so bad that it made me wonder who are all these people talking about race and gender in really problematic ways. And I had a mentor at the time. I was trying to figure out my PhD project. I was doing something completely different. I was like studying in Latin America and botanical plants, very different, but similar kinds of questions. Uh, and he told me that if I pick a topic that makes me so uncomfortable, I'll study it forever. And then lo and behold, I went to a DEI training and it made me so uncomfortable. And now here I am studying it forever.
And then mine was, because of my background in linguistics in particular, I went to a training that was talking explicitly about inclusive communication and communication practices. And I was sitting in the room like, no, no, that's not how language works. No, that's not how we think about actual interaction. And that was one of the things that really kind of sucked me into the space is thinking about how to take all of the fantastic work, theoretical work that's been done in linguistic anthropology and like how can we really use all of that theory to inform how we're doing and how we're designing these trainings that are really highly dependent on thinking about communication practices.
Oh, we definitely need your expertise in thinking about interaction and belonging. when I first started one of my jobs, one of my VPs told me one of the most difficult things about DEI is that you can't prove belonging and you can't measure it. And I was like, what are you talking about? Yes, we can measure belonging. The
No.
different conversation for the next episode, but you'll really like my experience in my bad workshop. You want to hear about it?
Oh, please, please. Let's start there, please.
So this was right around after the murder of Oscar Grant, and it was a workshop on leadership. And everyone attending was mostly people of color or women. I think maybe there was maybe one or two white men because it was a workshop for people who were underrepresented. And the facilitator was telling us about how we could be more inclusive leaders. And as he's telling us, oh, he was an older white man, which I think the context, the identity situation is important to understand.
Yeah.
So then he's telling us that when mitigating conflict, sometimes you can really go a long way in making people feel included and heard if you just touch them on the
Oh,
shoulder. And then he proceeded to go touch the shoulder of one of the only Black women in the room.
no.
Yeah.
No.
Yes. Mhm. Yeah.
That's so uncomfortable.
Inclusive leadership.
Oh,
Not. Yeah. It was really bad. So it was really poorly received. And, like it was absolutely uncomfortable for the person. And everyone about the room could see how problematic it was. And we just all collectively like gasped, whether audibly or not audibly. It was very clear to the point where that woman spoke up and corrected his behavior in the moment and said, "You don't understand how problematic it is what you just did." And it just spiraled out of control. So,
yeah. That's a I will give you a I'm not going to give you a communication one, but I will give you another training that was around race. And I was on a panel with another quote unquote expert. And and we were asked a question about race and how we think about and define race. And this person started talking about, they actually started the conversation with, well, it was also a white man, which is important for context because he then said, my black friend, and then
oh,
continued on. And I was like, oh no, how am I on this panel right now? And I just waited until he finished. And then I said, well, when I think about race, and then I gave kind of like a broader definition of like the history of racial categories, and I went in that direction to try to repair
mm,
what had just happened. But that was another kind of example. And I do want to
mm.
say we just came up with two examples where it was white men, but like I know some white men that are very, very good trainers, right? So this isn't, but this is important for context and thinking about these situations and talking about race.
And so if you are just listening for the first time, Missy's a white woman. I'm a woman of color, Mexican background, also important in terms of these discussions. And one of the things that is so important is like both of these things are micro inequities, which we can talk about at a different episode. But if you're a DEIB trainer and you're not aware about the common micro inequities, that's a problem, right? Because we're not trying to gatekeep anyone from being a DEIB trainer. Just because both of these experiences come from white men, it doesn't mean that those are always the bad experiences. So we can go and talk about what has made a bad experience in other ways, in other contexts, but anyone can be a good DEIB trainer. Anyone can do it. And it's important to know what are the common pitfalls that people fall under when they're not doing this from an informed, educated, and really balanced perspective.
Yep,
So maybe get into that.
I think so. So I think on that front, to Lucy's point, like I think that one of the things that we emphasize to mitigate some of those kinds of issues is that you yourself should raise your level of self-awareness and like take yourself through the process, especially if speaking as a white person that ends up in spaces training about race. And you really need to do some self-reflection work and recognize your positionality in order to speak with people about race and racial injustices and repair and that kind of work, because you need to understand it intimately and understand your own, positionality and the own the things that you yourself um, have and have not experienced in order to be able to come into those spaces and speak intelligently about doing DEI work around race. And you're going to make mistakes and you're never going to be perfect, but you have to understand like your positionality, where you've come from, and the wider kind of context of race in the United States. So that's a level of upskilling that just needs to happen if you are, right, depending on your positionality before you go into those training spaces.
And this ties into one of the other main things that we see on the kind of other end of the spectrum. So one end of the spectrum is like complete lack self-awareness of our own positionality. And on the other side of this spectrum is like almost like we use our own positionality as a weapon to guilt and shame others who don't have that awareness. Right. So it's like these two like spectrums where we go too far on the other end, we end up guilting, shaming others, making them feel bad, and under the guise of calling out. And I know maybe I'm going to be called out for taking this position, but we don't believe in calling people out at all. Like our approach is the opposite, which is calling in and really trying to create points of connection with people, because the tons of literature and research shows that shaming and guilt tripping people in the context of learning, it's actually counterproductive.
Hmm. So, we're clearly on the same page about this, but we agree that, this is a learning space and there may be spaces for calling out. But if you are in a learning space and it's a DEI learning space, then that is not the time to be calling folks out because they're there to learn. And the more that you call folks out, the less that they, right, are maybe willing to move forward. So this is, right, thinking about, if people feel too guilty or too scared to like try to change something or try new things, then this can be counterproductive in a training setting.
Mm-hmm. And this reminds me of the now really popular concept of psychological safety. Right? There's different components of psychological safety. One is inclusion safety, whether you're including people and asking them to participate. One is learner safety, whether people feel like they can learn. And there's two more, but off the top of my head, I don't remember. Do you remember the other two? No. Don't worry, we train on this, but we get our brains cannot retain all the things that we train about. One of them is whether you can use your talents creatively, and I think one of them is being a change agent. If I'm wrong about that, we'll put it on the show notes.
Yeah, it's there are four levels, and each level that you go through, and I don't remember the specific names, but it's like whether or not you feel like you actually belong, and then whether you can learn an upskill, whether you can like actually contribute your opinion, and then whether or not you can not just contribute your opinion, but like counter like the opinions of others to actually move in a different direction. So
That's
that's yeah.
because it was inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, and changing something safety. But both
You
of
figure it out.
Uh, but part of that is that people have to be willing to take risks. And people are not going to take risks. That's where I was going with all of that, by the way. People are not going to be taking risks if you're calling them out, guilting them, or shaming them.
Hmm.
Which actually, one of the things that we have found more effective than doing all of those things that bring that spectrum together is Missy and I talk about our positionality all the time. And we role play vulnerability and we give examples of us making mistakes. And when we're talking about micro inequities, for example, I give examples of when I've done a micro inequity, just like today or last week. And that might seem taboo, like how can a DEI professional be admitting to doing a micro inequity? But we all do these kinds of things and we all do mistakes. And it's how do we address it and learn and grow from it? And to have that space of where people are willing to grow, you kind of have to make them feel like they can also be vulnerable too.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to do that because I think being there's a difference between being a DEIB professional and DEIB expertise because, part of I think being a professional and having a certain level of expertise is really realizing that it's always a process and it's always a process of growth. And so knowing that everyone's going to make mistakes is an important place to start from if you have a learning mindset and that is the direction that you are trying to take people in. And I always say that if someone hadn't given me that space, then I don't know where I would be as, growing up in a rural place that was 99% white. And like, if someone hadn't given me the grace to learn and grow, then I would not be in the position that I'm in now. And I try to give others that grace.
And it's so important because we do want to go into any DEI learning experience with the intention that we want people to grow and to learn and take whatever small portion of that training and incorporate it. That's great. If that means that now you're becoming an expert to doing these trainings like 40 different times, like one of our clients is doing, then excellent. If you are just encountering this material for the first time and you took away one definition, great. You have a workbook to reference. But it's a tit for tat situation. Like the learner and the instructor are in a specific kind of dynamic, and that dynamic needs to be preserved with integrity. You have to cultivate that relationship in that space and build a relationship of trust, respect, and have it be mutual in both directions. And as an instructor, you have more power and more influence to set the tone, create community standards, and shape how that space is going to unfold. If you're shaming or calling people out, other people are going to do the same. So recognize that positionality, your power, your intent, and act accordingly to what you want to achieve.
Yep. Agree. And I think you brought up a point that gets to like another critique that I think is well worth addressing, and that is when we think about some counterproductive DEI trainings, um, there's often, right, I call it the one and done model, right? Like where even if you only have 1 day or 1 hour or you know one encounter with material, you should have some type of follow-up activity, some type of like clear pathway for applying what you've learned or practicing, some type of tool for applied activities. And then something that we'll get into again, and that's like some type of tracking, like what did this material do to actually create behavioral change? And that is not something that I've seen in very many DEI trainings. It's something that we really emphasize, but it's often absent is this kind of like follow up and continued, right, unpacking.
Yeah, and that one is really challenging because you're limited a lot by that client relationship, right? If they've just invited you to be a guest speaker, it's going to be very different than if they invited you to do 4 sessions of a topic where you can develop that relationship over time. But regardless, to your point, you should have some kind of follow-up activities or ways that they're tracking progress. And it reminds me of one of the big critiques in the literature around why DEIB trainings are not good or impactful in because they research shows that they don't really do much for changing attitudes or mindsets on DEI. And so the response to that from a lot of professionals is right, but you should be changing behavior. Because there's one thing about you're someone who is bigoted or biased, right? Let's say someone is that way. Okay, they can be bigoted and biased in their mind, but they should definitely not be bigoted and biased in the workplace, right? With their behaviors. And that is something that you can change. And one of these things why these tracking and these tools are useful because you can set those expectations around behavior, even if you're not necessarily changing their mind because they went to one lecture or they did one training. And
Hmm.
that's where those tracking tools come in handy because they can apply what they've learned over time. And you can follow up with people if you integrate it into other things like employee evaluations. You can integrate it into your team expectations around behaviors that they could be doing in the team. You can integrate it into new initiatives that you do, right? There's many different ways to follow up on a training that is not just more training. It's how do you apply what you've learned? Oh,
Yep. And that it's just it's critically important. And I really like the the kind of dichotomy of like thinking about behavioral change and thinking about like change in attitude. And I think that there's oftentimes, I think this idea that it must change in your mind before the behavior changes, rather than thinking of the behavioral change and the change in attitude as something that's like, and if you're listening, I'm making a little like infinity sign with my finger, right? Because it's like they reinforce one another. So if you can track and require behavioral change, then that can reinforce the kind of change in attitude as well. So the attitude change doesn't have to be a precursor to behavioral change and vice versa.
I love that. And that you mentioned that because it makes me think of, going to the gym. If you haven't gone to the gym ever, you show up to the gym, you're going to hate it. Then you're going to hate it again. Then you're going to hate it again. But then by the 100th time you've been to the gym, now you crave it. Now you need to go to the gym. You can't go to sleep without going to the gym. And I think about like behavior and attitudes a lot in that way that you were just mentioning it is sometimes just doing the thing over and over and over again is going to make you feel better or different about the thing that you've been doing this whole time. And that's a really, really great point that you're making, Missy, because I don't think there's really research on that, like DEI trainings that have persisted over time through the behaviors that people have done, right? That kind of measurement is difficult to track in the academic record. But what we do know from other kinds of studies is that mindsets do change from behavior change.
Hmm. Yep. So the one and done model really is something that I think deserves critique and is something that, we encourage people that we work with to look at that more carefully rather than like, shoehorning in one training for 1 hour. Like, okay, but what are you going to do after the fact to make sure that this is worth everyone's time and worth the resources to actually do this kind of training?
Absolutely.
And so that also speaks to a like we can critique all day. We can critique all day, right? That speaks to another critique, and that's about not thinking about what we might call recursive materials delivery, right? So,
Oh,
um,
right. The word, Missy, recursive materials delivery. By the way, this is the first time I've heard of this. So please, this means.
So thinking about, I think that in kind of educational settings, there's sometimes the idea that you need to always provide as much information as possible and all has to be new, right?
Yeah.
But really, people learn by encountering the same idea over and over again. And so the idea that you just kind of, I don't know, fire hose a whole bunch of new stuff at people is sometimes how some people think about educating, but really the better way to do it is to introduce a topic and then revisit the topic and then revisit the topic and then revisit the topic. And that's the idea of recursivity, right? You recursively revisit it in a slightly different angle, right? Or just repeating the information. And that's something that I've seen in lots of different spaces, not just DEI spaces, in like adult education models. That is something that I always like to point to and say that's not actually how people usually learn in a way that they retain and are able to apply things in the real world.
Yes. And it also just makes me think about, again, we're in a structure where things are sometimes limited and we're not able to do that because we have a pathways model where we have 4 sessions and usually companies that do this is they want to have a baseline education of DEIB. So it goes everything from cultural awareness to allyship. We have 4 modules to do that. And in that, we employ that recursive modeling because what we introduce in the very first one, we kind of reintroduce in different ways, in different settings. Um, Compared to, are you seeing a squirrel right now?
There is, sorry.
Is
Yep,
she
yep, you
smiling?
can tell.
Not saying anything to make you smile.
Mhm.
but but as I was saying, the we can do that because we have 4 different sessions and we do them over time. Sometimes companies might not invest in the same topic 2 times in a row, right? If they do something for like Black History Month, let's have a keynote speaker to talk on this one topic. They will hesitate having another speaker speak on a similar topic 6 months down the line, even the next year, even though it's been enough time has gone by that I'm sure no one really remembers what happened with that first speaker. Or and if they did, it's not a bad idea to hear those concepts again. And definitely taking the time and accepting and being okay with repeating material is not something that people like to do, but it's important to learning, as they mentioned.
Yes, it is. And um, let me give, we always like to give the opposite. So let me give you the complete opposite, um, kind of interpretation that is something else that I've seen happen. And that is not some companies do the exact same training every year. That is also something that can make people check out. If you're not, especially if it's just training and then nothing in between, which is actually about application and other things, that if you give the same recorded training and require people to take it from year to year, then that's also something that is a potential kind of like not counterproductive, but potential waste of resources because you're not necessarily thinking about it from a different angle or doing it in a way that's engaging or tracking how people are actually applying what they're learning. And instead, you're like, it feels very much like you're just checking a box instead of facilitating learning.
But one thing you can do here when you're like, okay, well, then not too much of the new material and repeat the same material, you can think about having different modalities for your content, right? You might choose to bring a presenter on the topic one time. You might choose to have videos as well. You might choose to do like a gallery walk of a certain topic, right? Having different ways of presenting the material in new and creative different ways can really be helpful for not just reintroducing the topic, but also appealing to different learning styles or different learning capabilities.
Yep, absolutely. So, I'll kind of then I think that leads us to one of, I think, I don't know how many more critiques we have, but this is another kind of like pedagogically problematic thing, and that is that we've also seen trainings that have uh, no learning objectives whatsoever. So it's like topic based, but they aren't designed to think about what they want people to take away from them. So just speaking, giving a speech about a topic is very different than actually creating a learning experience for people. And that requires that you actually think about what your objectives are, what you want people to take away, and then make sure what you're doing in the session actually gets to those learning objectives.
That sounds so simple, but it's not, right? If you have an education background, you're drilled with learning objectives since when you start learning about education. If you've never had an education background and you're asked to do a training or do a workshop on something, you might have to teach yourself learning objectives. And even those people that know how to do learning objectives well, where they end up missing the mark is that if they have activities, there's no learning objectives to the activities. And to your point, they have to reinforce all the content has to go back to the learning objective. And the learning objective basically sounds like by the end of this training, you should be able to do A, B, C. Whether that is you should be able to understand the definition of micro inequities. You should be able to identify three most common unconscious biases, right? And then you make sure that all the content in that training is tying back to those learning objectives, including the activity. So
Mhm.
what happens a lot of times when learning objectives are not included in the activity is this has happened to me in delivering other sessions. I have seen that people in those activities take the activities in like a million different directions. One activity will have a discussion about politics. Another activity, same activity, will have a different discussion about history. And then you're just like, why is everyone having different conversations when it's supposed to be the same training?
Mhm.
So make sure that there's a purpose to everything in there. And that purpose is they're helping you achieve your learning objectives.
Absolutely. So please do have activities because, um, I make a joke, but I'm like, maybe this is a bad joke for people listening to our podcast, but I'm like, you don't want to just listen to me talk for 75 minutes. This podcast has a different objective though. But in learning spaces, like y'all don't want to listen to me talk about this really specific topic for 75 minutes if the whole goal is for you to learn how to not just recall it but apply it. So we are kind of adamant about making sure we have like even little mini activities or mini discussions embedded so that people are engaging with the topics and the materials while we're teaching them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how many of you are listening are educators, but it's really common to ask a question. Any questions? And then no one has a question, but then you have them talk about it for 5 minutes and now everyone has a question, right? So just the activity itself help them process the information so that they're actually absorbing the content and that they're applying it to your point, because it's pointless to just understand DEI if you're not applying it into your everyday.
Absolutely. So I don't know. I mean, have we critiqued DEI trainings enough for being counterproductive? Is there any other critique that you would like to add?
Let's see, DEIB trainings. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what works well, what we have seen work well. We
Yeah,
talked a little bit earlier about showing up as a facilitator from a vulnerable position really helps to break the ice, to get people to be vulnerable themselves, and to create that environment where people feel like comfortable to contribute.
absolutely. And I'll say, in that vein, thinking about, especially because I train about communication a lot, modeling the communication and the interaction patterns that you're trying to teach is also something that is like sneaky but good, because not only are you talking about the communication patterns, but you're modeling them. So, to Lucy's point, if you're asking people to be vulnerable yourself. If you're teaching people inclusive communication, then model the kinds of things that you are asking people to do and apply.
Mhm. And on calling it in, it's challenging sometimes when we hear or see someone who might make a comment that sounds offensive or antagonistic in a workshop. And where you're able to provide that opportunity, ask them questions like, what do you mean by that? Can you give me an example? And prompt more curiosity than judgment. So that's another thing that works really well is you being as a facilitator or for the instructor to be curious about the environment they're in, because every learning situation is going to be different, especially as a DEIB professional. You oftentimes are training people who are in different spaces all the time. Or if you're in the same organization, even the knowledge that is in that room about that topic is going to be different and unpredictable. So having that curiosity mindset is also a really good way to build rapport.
Mhm. Um, and you know, I think this all swirls around vulnerability, but also being able to admit what you don't know
Mhm.
in those spaces, and where you yourself need to upskill is really useful. And at the same time, making sure that before you go into those spaces, that you yourself have done the work to reflect and to upskill. And I know that in the really good trainings that I've been in, I can see that the facilitator has done their homework and and is still able and willing to admit when there are things that they don't know or questions that they can't quite answer.
Yeah, the experts, and even though they might be experts in one topic, they're not going to be in all the topics. So you learn this, the more you know what you don't know, right? So it's really important, to your point, to be humble about what we can provide and what we can provide, and to say, I don't have that for you now, but I will, like, by the end of the session. Missy and I are often asked to give examples or provide resources, and we do when we haven't. And when we don't, we say, we'll get it to you next time.
Mhm.
It's following through on those promises.
Yes. I think those are some good, right? So we've given you enough critiques. We've given you some good ways to approach training. I think one thing that um, all of this also coalesces around is in good DEI trainings, people don't necessarily stick to the script and are really flexible and able to facilitate, respond to questions, invite questions and things that might arise. And that also takes some practice because, when you invite questions, you can't stick to any script that you have created for that training or that session, but your participants will probably get a lot more out of it if you can let it be their own and let them take it in the direction that they need to take it in.
Yeah, within guardrails. So within the topic that you're talking about at that moment. But absolutely. And the other thing is, like, while you might be listening, you might never do a DEIB training. But this is some things to keep in mind if you're in the process of hiring one, to ask them questions to see what they do when they are asked a question that they don't anticipate, right? You can ask them directly, tell me how you handled a participant in the audience who gave you a really difficult question that you couldn't answer. But you can use this episode to think about some questions you might ask for those DIB trainers so that you can select a good one that is going to be really effective and really influential. And the other thing is, I think a lot of these tips help us just generally be better to each other in a lot of our team spaces and dynamics. We might not need to be a trainer to take some of these good practices home with us, especially around asking questions, being curious, and giving people and having the flexibility to navigate those challenging environments.
And being vulnerable in any DEI space. If you're, again, I want to point out that there are times to call people out, but if your goal is learning and growth and facilitating learning and growth, then, right, that's the time to be vulnerable, to be curious, to ask questions. And so just know that if that is your role and that is your goal, then this is what we're giving you, this kind of like, that's what we're covering. Because there are times that people need to be called out. But if your goal is education and like facilitating that, um, you know, uh, we will fight about it, but right, that we are really not big on the call out culture.
Yeah. And it sounds like we're wrapping up the episode.
I think so.
Yeah. So if you have any questions about this and this prompts other thoughts on you on what are other critiques, definitely DIB trainings can be counterproductive. They can do more damage than do good. And sometimes Missy and I are asked to come in and repair the work that bad DEIB trainers have done in the past. So please, be discerning when choosing someone for your DIB initiatives. And also know that not all else is lost. If people say DIB trainings are always bad, you can have some ways to have a rebuttal on that statement by naming specifically how they could be better.
And if you yourself are, you know, either doing DEIB trainings or working towards that, I hope we haven't scared you away from it. Because I think this kind of education can happen not only in the formal kinds of spaces, but as we were kind of closing down to the point, right? If we have this kind of learning and growth mindset when we're talking about these topics, I hope that you feel more empowered to take some of these things into the informal learning that can happen in everyday conversations around these topics and issues. Because, you all can be, right, DEI or DEIB trainers in these little kind of micro ways. And that's an important, contribution if you're in the position to be able to do that.
I love that because you're all DIB advocates if you're listening to this podcast. So you can take what little nuggets of information will make you better at teaching others and instructing others, even in this, as you mentioned, micro ways of learning in your everyday.
I think that's a great place to end, don't you?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So until next time, we'll let you know as we continue our series of common critiques of DEIB and how we might address them. But please, as we said, reach out to us if you have a specific question or critique that you would like us to address. And until next time, we hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thanks everyone for
Yeah.
listening.
Thank you. See you soon.